Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. It's me, and today I'm gonna rant unnecessarily for so many minutes about how Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were cooperatively so good that they ruined a bunch of other games for me. This video has been brewing almost since I restarted this channel this last summer, but I wanted to make sure that I got this right, and I didn't want to say anything that was just me being overly dramatic in the moment. So a couple of months later, here's me being premeditatedly overly dramatic about a couple of dumb video games. Okay, first some background. My first exposure to The Legend of Zelda was the original game from 1986 on the NES. We had some old Nintendo consoles at home, and so I ended up playing a lot of these older Nintendo games growing up. Unfortunately for me, Legend of Zelda was one of the games that I never finished because I was too busy with other games that were often similarly aged. I would occasionally play around with Zelda for maybe an hour, then put it away again for a few months. I liked its aesthetic and it was intriguing, but I couldn't really ever get into the gameplay. It just wasn't my thing. I wasn't a big fan of the dungeons, and as iconic as the game was, it didn't age as well as, say, Mario 3, which is obviously a crying shame. I remember seeing ads and promotions for Breath of the Wild when it came out, but our family didn't have a console new enough to run it, and I wasn't spending that kind of money on a game anyway, so I never paid it much attention. It looked cool, it just wasn't something that was reasonably on my radar. Fast forward past middle school and high school and even college, I was on YouTube one day and saw a trailer for Tears of the Kingdom and thought to myself, oh hey, this looks pretty good. I did some investigative journalism and it seemed like a solid game, but I wanted to look into its prequel first since I knew there was one. I plugged a search into YouTube for some reviews in the trailer and oh boy, where was this game all my life? Just a personal opinion, but this is the best game trailer ever made. I love that it's mostly done with in-game footage with fancy camera manipulation, and re-seeing the trailer after playing the game almost made me cry again because there's bits and pieces of like every sad memory in there. Just from the trailer, I almost instantly fell in love with Breath of the Wild. I had a really good feeling about this game. These two Zelda games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, got me, a punk who had stuck to PC gaming ever since moving out of his parents' house purely because of the cost of consoles, to buy my first console in the form of a Switch. And look, I'm a game nerd and a proper lore junkie, so I caught up on the 31 years of game lore from the games between NES, Legend of Zelda, and Breath of the Wild, so I knew all the basics of what had happened in those games, and I was way hyped to play some Zelda. And 2 weeks later, when my Switch arrived in the mail, it did not disappoint. By the time I finished my first playthrough of Breath of the Wild, it was already one of my favorite games of all time. I'm in like top 5. And that's some fierce competition up there. This game was in the same tier as Hollow Knight after one playthrough, and it wasn't even a high percent playthrough. My game completion wasn't even 15% when I first beat it. But for a while there, I played Zelda for like 4 hours a day, which I would generally consider an unhealthy amount. Breath of the Wild swept me away to this tragic, ruined, yet beautiful and wondrous kingdom filled with fearsome enemies, epic locations, goofy characters, and a plot that, while simple, was incredibly well told and invested me emotionally into a game in a way that no other game ever really has, in a way that most books and films never have. Out of all the gaming experience I've had, my first playthrough of Breath of the Wild was definitely my most investing. I teared up at the last few memories, I flat up cried when I finished the game. This still gets me sometimes. And countless other small things turned my journey through Hyrule into an emotional roller coaster, whether it was hearing Daruk's humorous voice from within Vah Rudania, or noting the metaphorical meaning of Link's memory of Zelda in the meadow, or laughing as I accidentally blew myself up with bomb arrows on Death Mountain for the 9th or 10th time, or even just gazing over the ruins of Akala Citadel or Fort Hitano covered in fallen guardians. The entire game is bathed in this simultaneous melancholy and wonder. Regardless of Breath of the Wild's flaws, I've never seen a game so perfectly fit its tone and themes into every aspect of the game. Storytelling, world design, game mechanics, art style, all of it. As someone who generally replays his games a lot, I can say with confidence that even if I never got to play Breath of the Wild again, my money was well spent on this game. It was and is truly a masterpiece. And I'm halfway through a second playthrough, and it's still an excellent experience. I think part of why I loved Breath of the Wild so much was because I hadn't been exposed to all the Zelda games in between Breath of the Wild and the first one. My only exposure to Legend of Zelda at that point was the original Legend of Zelda from 1986 and a Nintendo Land minigame. In 1986, Zelda was decidedly open world. One of the reasons I could never get into Zelda 1 was because I didn't care for the dungeons much and preferred trying to make progress elsewhere, either by collecting resources or exploring. But the game intrigued me and I wished I enjoyed it more. From my perspective, and probably only from my perspective, Breath of the Wild took the Zelda series in the most natural direction possible, building on top of all the best parts of Zelda 1 without getting hung up on its weak points. The game was not only more open world than ever, but it was a near-perfect example of how to make an open-world game in the first place. The dungeons that I didn't really like in the original game were both smaller and completely different, with the Divine Beasts taking their place. I know a lot of people don't like the Divine Beasts since they're not really dungeons, but that was the same reason that I liked them. And I know that they all aesthetically look the same, but as far as the gameplay goes, they each have some interesting gimmicks that differentiate themselves from each other. Another thing that I loved was that the world in Breath feels massive, but never quite so massive that you can't keep track of where things are. It's not overwhelmingly huge, and each region feels so carefully tailored to be thematically unique. Not to mention that Hyrule is just absolutely gorgeous. Like, just look at this place. This was very refreshing for me as someone who was in the process of burning out on procedurally generated games like Minecraft. On top of all this, there were the countless clear callbacks to the original Zelda that were sprinkled throughout Breath of the Wild that just made it really special for me. It was as if Breath was specifically tailored towards me, and this is where Zelda started to ruin gaming for me. I know full well that not every game could possibly feel like this, but I do wish they could, and this depreciated my view of a fair number of other games. It's not like Breath of the Wild is a perfect game. It has its fair share of weaknesses. The difficulty I thought was far too easy, especially with regards to the bosses, and while the enemies varied greatly insofar as their strengths, weaknesses, and abilities, there was an underwhelming number of types of enemies. And the shrines are, well, most of them aren't bad, but they are kind of the weakest aspect of the game. But the overall approach that the game makes to the open world setting is nearly flawless. I lent my brother my Switch for a while at a family get-together, and despite the fact that he approached the starting area in a very different way from myself, his methods seem just as supported by the game as mine. And the combat is, despite its various flaws, a lot of fun. Counter to the common wisdom, I like how weapon durability means that your collection of weapons is constantly changing. Probably my favorite part of Breath of the Wild on my first playthrough though, and this may sound strange to some, was seeking out the memories. It mixed all the best elements of a scavenger hunt and the amnesia story trope into something that I found immensely satisfying. Even though I had had spoilers on a majority of these memories, because, like I said before, this is a 6-year-old game, there was something about finding and seeing them that I have a hard time describing. And it's kind of too bad that this was one of my favorite parts of the game, because it's not something that you can really experience the same way again on the second playthrough. And then I played Tears of the Kingdom, and it was really good too. As my biggest complaint about Breath of the Wild is that it's too easy, Tears of the Kingdom was great, as it pushes the difficulty up a notch or two. And Tears is more expansive than Breath ever was, but it didn't evoke the sense of emotion for me the way Breath did. It didn't make me whoop in excitement as often, it didn't carry as strong of an atmosphere, and the emotional stakes of the story didn't captivate me the way that Breath of the Wilds did. And I think this is because the environmental storytelling is more or less absent in Tears of the Kingdom. Also, I liked the Sheikah tech a lot more than the Zonai green goop tech, and I preferred how it was in Breath of the Wild when the Zonai were just this mysterious, mystical tribe. Now, I wasn't disappointed by Tears. It met my expectations, it just didn't exceed them. In many ways, Tears has improved on Breath of the Wild's foundation, and not just in scope. The boss fights are a lot more unique and epic, and it gives players more freedom than ever with abilities like Ultra Hand to make vehicles and war machines, but at least for me, Breath of the Wild is the preferred Zelda game. Still, Tears of the Kingdom was one of the better games I've played. It was still a lot of fun, super interesting and unique, and the ending. What? The ending boss is... What? The lead up to the final battle is massive in scale, descending deeper than ever into the depths and fighting through Ganon's forces alongside the sages, and then you actually get to the final fight. I fought Ganondorf on 4 hearts because I was out of Gloom Food, and this was the most intense, most epic final boss battle I've ever seen. It is difficult to verbally describe because it's genuinely a work of art. I lost it when Ganondorf dodged a flurry rush, when his health bar grew back to twice its original size, and when his attacks deleted my hearts instead of just dealing gloom damage. This 4-stage grand finale to Tears of the Kingdom was just so good. I must admit, I'm one of the losers who takes some issues with Tears' actual story ending, but man was that final boss fight just the best. While Breath of the Wild was maybe emotionally the best game I've ever played, Tears of the Kingdom was mechanically one of the better games I've played. I was not very okay for a little while after beating Breath and Tears. The train ride that these 2 games had simultaneously been one of the most touching and most exhilarating experience I've found in a medium of storytelling or entertainment. The sad part about this is that it's not something that you can really recreate on a second playthrough. Of course, I still play both these games because they're really good. I'm on my second playthrough of both these games now, but neither of these games can possibly be the same on a second playthrough. And now to be more to the point, these games also kind of ruined a lot of gaming for me. They gave me a sense of wonder and excitement and investment that not even they themselves could pull off on a second playthrough. And with maybe one exception when it comes to environment and mechanics, I've never seen another game that could reach those heights in the first place either. Which is fine, those first playthroughs of both games were still totally worth it, but the withdrawal was pretty rough for the first couple of weeks after beating them. It felt much the same as finishing a really good book series. I didn't just have a harder time with games, I had to take a short hiatus from movies because the fallout from these games was so bad. And since then, I've gotten over some of that. It's not like I don't play games anymore, but I don't play video games quite as often or for nearly as long because they just don't quite feel the same anymore. Einstein's theory of relativity wouldn't allow it. It's not like Zelda ruined every game for me. My favorites are still lots of fun, and multiplayer games with friends are still a blast. But I've ended up spending a lot less time playing games than I used to. They're just not quite the same anymore, because almost none of them have quite the same mastery of engaging mechanics, artistic style, emotional storytelling, and everything in between. I didn't expect this depreciation to happen at first, but even as I was getting closer to finishing Breath, I had a feeling that there would be a difference. That's okay though, and it's probably actually for the better. Playing less games has given me time to do other, probably more worthwhile things. I toyed around with writing for the first time in over a year after beating Tears. I resumed posting content on this channel as I was playing these games. So maybe it's a good thing that Zelda ruined gaming for me. And yes, ruined is probably too strong a word. Diminish is probably a more accurate term. This video could have been a lot longer. It probably could have been a couple of hours if I really wanted it to be, but I don't think that it would be helpful to elaborate on every little detail of my experience with these 2 masterpieces. Anyway, thanks for sticking around for this entirely unnecessary rant. I'd say see you later, but I can't see through your camera or vice versa, so without further ado, bye.